Good afternoon, and welcome to the 117th annual meeting of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. This is our second meeting that's being held online only. My name is Penny Greenberger, and I am proud to serve as a co-chair for today's event with my husband, Bob.
Penny and I are so happy to have you be a part of today's meeting. It's a privilege to serve our community as co-chairs for this special event. It's an opportunity to celebrate what makes Federation special: the strong partnership between our volunteer leaders and professional staff, and the collaboration we foster to make life better and more meaningful in Jewish Cleveland and Greater Cleveland, as well as around the world. This past year has certainly been a testament of this strength.
We are looking forward to celebrating our community together, which means safely in our homes. And we eagerly anticipate the time when we will be able to come together in person soon, we hope.
It's truly an honor to be here among our community and our leadership. Federation Board Chair David Heller and President Erica Rudin-Luria. I'd also like to recognize our past board chairs who have helped keep Jewish Cleveland thriving. Please join me in recognizing our past board chairs. I'm thrilled we have so many of our past campaign chairs on today's webcast. These community leaders have each played a critical role in elevating Jewish Cleveland year after year. I'd also like to acknowledge Bradley Sherman, our 2021 campaign chair. Under your direction, Jewish Cleveland came together to raise $33.1 million for more than 12,000 donors and more than $15.4 million for Jewish Cleveland's Coronavirus Emergency Relief Fund on behalf of the community. Thank you very much.
At this time, we'd like to thank and invite Rabbi Joshua Scoff to present the invocation.
Hello, everybody. At one point in my married life, I was given permission to have a man cave of sorts. And I began by hanging up about a half a dozen photos that I always wanted to put up on the wall. More would follow, but I started with about a half a dozen that I had on my mind for a long time. My son walked around when he first looked at it, and he said, "Dad, you realize that all of these photos are from when you were 6 or 7 or 8 years old. They're all from those years when you were so young." And I looked around, I hadn't noticed it, he was right. They were all from when I was a very young child. People I had been taken with when I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, whether it was the photo of Bobby Kennedy or the photo of Vince Lombardi or of Batman. These were all figures that I remembered from the time I was very, very young. You never know when a strong impression is made on a young child. And we know this from our own stories. When Moses goes out to see his brothers and sisters, the Hebrews, and he sees them as slaves, the question is asked, how does he know that they're his brothers and sisters? He's been raised in the palace. How does he know he's a Hebrew? And the answer is that when he was very young, his mother, who was nursing him, raised him to know who his people was. He knew from those stories because we acknowledge that what you hear, what you see when you're very, very young stays with you forever. When Samuel the prophet begins his service and his mother brings him to the temple to become a prophet in the temple, do you know that Samuel is only 4 years old? Because again, we understand that impressions are made when you're very, very young. And I won't even go to the story of Isaac up on the mountain with his father. According to some, he was 7 years old, and what impression that might have had on Isaac. So I not only remember Bobby Kennedy and Vince Lombardi, I remember when I was a young child, I remember when members of the community, like the Federation, came to our day school in St. Louis because it was the 6-Day War. And as a young child, I remember very precisely the rabbis of the day school, the members of the community, the members of the Federation of St. Louis, helping to lead prayers each of those 6 days of the war. To a young child, I never forgot. Of all the work that the Federation does, education is the key, and it begins at the youngest age. When we run programs at every level, and you look out at your audience, see the faces of the young, I wonder whether we realize that the greatest impression you might make in a given lecture or program may be on the little child. And you may not even know if they're paying attention. But believe me, I certainly know the impression that can be made on a young child, because all those impressions remained with me as I grew into adulthood. So now show me the children on the screen. I want you all see these children on the screen. That's me and my buddies and the obligatory little sister who was allowed to play with us. Now, I want you to know, the next time anyone leads an educational program and you look out at your audience, look at the kids that look like these four. You might be tempted to think they're not even paying attention to me. But indeed, you never know the impression that you might make on a child this age, because it was approximately at this age when the 6-Day War occurred and when those representatives of Federation in the community came to speak to us. So kids that look like this may be receiving an impression that they will never, ever forget, whether it's politics, whether it's inspirational heroes, or whether it's Israel. I can tell you what I learned at that age certainly made impression on me. And I guarantee you it made an impression. I'm second from the right. It made an impression also on the guy next to me in the Cardinals jersey. You see the Cardinals jersey? It certainly made an impression on him, because that little boy standing next to me is your guest speaker today, David Makovsky.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, who's today on today's program. He's a Middle East expert, David Makovsky. He's the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Previously, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian negotiations, a former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post. He is the author of multiple books as well, and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israel conflict. After we hear from David, there's going to be an opportunity for everyone to have a short question and answer period. So please feel free to submit any questions you have using the Q&A box in Zoom. Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome David Makovsky.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Bob, very much. And thank you, Cleveland. I think this pandemic has proved once again why you're considered a thriving community, a thriving, resilient community. Really rallies at a time of crisis. It meets challenges head on, doesn't shirk from them, and it just meets the moment. And that's, watching this video, it sounds like that's exactly what you've done, and you've kept to your reputation. Martin Luther King once said, "Only when it's dark do you see the stars." And Pirkei Avot, it says, "Lafit Sarah Agra," according to the effort is the reward. It seems that at this time of darkness and peril, that you in Cleveland, like and others in the rest of the country, haven't always been as fortunate, but you have rallied a resilient community to greater heights. And that reward of resilience will really be clear in the years ahead, because you showed that a community could come together when it could not look worse. So it is remarkable what you've done, and really my hat's off to you. There's a reason why Cleveland is considered a model community in the United States. In the Jewish world, national, international leaders routinely come from Cleveland. There's a reason for it. I know whenever I get to speak to people in Cleveland, to your founders dinner, to other parts of your community, I know it's going to go well, because there's something, someone mentioned the secret sauce, I think of Cleveland. There's something in the water there, because there's a sense of vibrancy about the importance of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship and a strong Jewish community. So it's great for me to really be back among people that I know care so passionately about the U.S.-Israel relationship. I'm also humbled by my oldest friend in the world, Rabbi Josh Scoff, that he brought that photo out. He's I know a leader in your community, and I'm honored to call him really my oldest friend in the world. So thank you for that nice surprise. I do remember now that he remembered that 1967, all huddled together during the 6-Day War and saying prayers, and that is a memory for me in my early years. So thank you very much, Josh. Technology has been in some ways a blessing, as we've seen with the vaccine, how science, they're going to win the Nobel Prize, hopefully, for really bringing the world to such heights that we could start seeing vaccinations after this horrific pandemic. And certainly Israel, the state of Israel, there's no place in the world where the vaccination rollout has been faster. And that's also a beautiful sign of how technology could be part of a solution. What I'm here tonight is to talk about sometimes technology could also be part of a problem. And, we have limited time. I'm going to try to touch on 3 subjects very carefully, but hopefully add a little value to you. And that is the Iran negotiations, the issue of the state of play on the Israeli election formation, which sounds, it sounds crazy sometimes. And the whole really good news at a time where we are often used to think that bad news is the norm, the Abraham Accords, the hope of Arab states and Israeli normalization. And I look forward to any questions you may have. If you don't have time to ask me questions, you want to reach me, the Federation has my email, and I'll be happy to answer those I can't deal with. So maybe we'll start talking about Iran and where's the state of play. We have a map, I have a PowerPoint, just for people who don't know the map. You see Israel right in the middle there. And Iran is a massive country off to like 3 o'clock away from Israel. And so that is key. And that is also what something I'm going to mention that has brought Israel and the Arab states together. I jokingly say, it's only a joke, that the Iranians deserve a Nobel Prize for bringing Arabs and Israelis together against them, because the Arab world fears the Iranians. And when I talk to Arab diplomats, I close my eyes. I don't know if I'm talking to an Israeli or an Arab, because they feel the same way about Iran. So there's an effort now underway to try to see if you can blunt the Iranian nuclear effort. And that is being done. I think we have a slide here of, 2 things together, where we have a slide here of the Biden administration's priority, and Iran is in that top list to try to stop that Iranian threat. Nobody wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but frankly, a lot of the other priorities are not Middle East priorities, because COVID for the United States. It's so overwhelming. We've lost over 500,000 people, and the number is growing. There's the economic recovery, which you've mentioned, climate change, China, racial justice, rebuilding alliances. And then you see also the Iranian nuclear issue. That is the lead Middle Eastern issue for this administration. Now, we'll go to the next slide. And basically what we've seen is there's been a power outage at a place called Natanz. That is where Iran makes its nuclear fuel to build a bomb. To build a bomb, you need missiles, which Iran has. You need detonators, which they have. It's a needle in a haystack, but you'll never find it. The key is nuclear fuel. That's something you can measure. And the question is, how long does Iran have to build these bombs? So suddenly, and it's, Israel has been called, the perpetrators of this. Israel has not confirmed it, but there's been a power failure that suddenly the Natanz enrichment, the centrifuges to spin the nuclear fuel you need, there's been a big explosion, and Natanz has been kind of disempowered. Whether it's 6 months, 9 months is unclear. Some people thought, well, this will lead to the Vienna talks not going forward, and that has not been the case. The U.S. did not condemn Israel, and the talks are continuing. Israel has not, has not commented on it. Iran has called the attack nuclear terrorism. So what is going on at Vienna? Let's go to the next slide. Why is that somehow the focus? The focus there is to try to see if you could somehow bring things back to where they were in 2015. Clearly, Iran has an interest in getting those talks back because they want to get rid of the sanctions. The sanctions have really had a punishing impact on Iran, and they want the U.S. back in the deal. The U.S. is not coming back into the deal so fast because you blame the United States for pulling out, but look what you have done. What you have done is you have violated the deal by doing all this uranium enrichment. Let's go to the next slide. And you could see there, without getting too technical on you, because I don't want to bore you with any of this, but basically Iran under the deal was allowed to have 300 kilo but they have been, they said, well, America, you left the deal, we could do what we want. So we've now got 2 bombs worth. It isn't yet at the weaponization phase, but it's at the nuclear fuel is at the reactor phase. But from reactor to weapons grade, as you see with these 3 circles, most of the effort is to get to 20% enrichment. That's 90% of the way. And they are enriching at 90%. So it doesn't take much to go from reactor level to weapons grade level. And the United States is saying, you want us back in the deal, you got to get rid of all this nuclear fuel. We don't want you to have 2 bombs worth of fuel going forward. And that's a violation of the deal. You say we're in violation, you're in violation. So now what we're seeing is a kind of Viennese waltz, so to speak, to synchronize compliance for compliance. You want us in, fine, get rid of the uranium, and we have to verify that. And then we can talk about lifting the sanctions. Now, where's Israel in all this? That's the next slide. The Israeli view is, on one hand, here's the good news, and as people in Cleveland who care deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship, you should feel good about this, that I do believe, you could say, well, David, we're only at the start of the new administration, give it time. But I think both in Washington and in Jerusalem, both sides are trying to learn lessons from 2015 on what not to do, on to keep the tone civil, to make sure that things do not go off the rails between Washington and Jerusalem. You have differences, fine, express them privately. Don't go and have press conferences in the media and accuse the other side of things. And we saw this with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State's confirmation, where he said, I want to be with Israel and the Gulf states on the takeoff so we could be together on the landing. The tone of the secretary, the tone of the president is right, which is work with Israel and work with the Gulf. So the good news is the tone is good. The not as good news is there's a gap in policy. And that's, what I think you need to know, which is that the US and Israel all say the same, which is we don't want Iran to have a bomb. We don't think this deal is sufficient to stop it. We need what Biden has called for is a longer and stronger deal. And that's a code word for what we call the longer sunset clauses. That means longer restrictions on their ability to enrich nuclear fuel, because the nuclear fuel builds the nuclear bomb. And under the current deal, that comes off in a few years. So you want a longer and stronger deal. So where's the difference? You say, well, David, it sounds like everyone agrees. No one wants Iran to have a bomb. Everyone wants, there to be a longer sunset. Also, there's an inclusion of ballistic missiles. I don't even have it listed as bullet points, but better inspections, anytime, any place, more restrictions on their R&D, research and development capacity for more advanced centrifuges, things that spin faster and faster that can get the nuclear fuel in a more efficient way. So you can say, well, David, there's such agreement. What's the problem? The problem is that basically where Washington and Jerusalem differ is the Washington view is lock in what you got. First, don't overload the wagon or it'll tip over. And what you want to do is to make sure they ship out all the uranium, the 2 bombs worth, the 2,400 minus 300, 2,100 kilo of excess uranium. The US view is get rid of that stuff first, just get rid of it. And then we can talk about what I would call JCPOA 2.0, nuclear deal 2.0, the sequel, if you will. And the Israeli view is the only way to get to a sequel, the only guide road, pathway to go from 1.0 to 2.0 for a nuclear better deal that everyone wants is to maintain economic pressure on Iran. And the US agrees to that in theory, but says, well, we can always, some say, can you snap back the sanctions? Can you have the Treasury do what it did during the last few years, which was to say to European banks, you want to do business with America or you want to do business with Iran? Called secondary sanctions. Now, the administration doesn't want to go down that road because it wants to lock in the current deal, because it wants to ship out all the 2,100 kilo of excess uranium. And said, well, let's have that conversation from a lower baseline. First, get rid of the stuff. Lock it in. Once we lock it in, let's talk about how we can improve the deal. The Israeli view is once you get rid of all the sanctions, putting them back in is not going to be easy because you have to rebuild an international consensus. That's going to be hard to do. So that's really the fundamental thing. It's a philosophical issue, which is what is the role of leverage in a negotiation? That's what Washington and Jerusalem need to come together on. Next week, the chief of staff, the head of the Mossad, the head of military intelligence, the national security advisor of Israel are all coming to Washington for meetings. It sounds like one big delegation to discuss Iran. Actually, I don't know if it's precisely that, but I think it all comes down to that fundamental thing. How do you have leverage in a negotiation? That's a question you, I'm sure, in your business dealings have those same kinds of conversations. That's the question with the US and Israel. I think the Biden administration wants there to be leverage, but doesn't want to announce what it is for 2.0 until it locks in the deal where they ship out the uranium. Israel's view is whatever you don't say in advance and make public on economic pressure, 2.0 will be aspirational. You'll have said, I'm putting Iran back in the box, according to Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of President Biden, but will you take it out of the box to deal with it in a more fundamental way? What's Iran's incentive? And what's its disincentive not to do it? That's the fundamental philosophical conversation that the two sides have to have. So that's the first issue I just wanted to discuss, because that's the main thing. And I hope if you take away anything from my talk, you'll remember that sentence, that Washington and Jerusalem have to come together on that fundamental point, which is what is the leverage to get the better deal that everybody says they want? Why will Iran agree to that? What leverage is there on Iran? That's the question they have to solve. The second issue is like, when you deal with Israeli politics, it's like putting your head in a washing machine. And so I follow this stuff very carefully, but I don't want to drive people crazy. But I must say here, if I look at the three options, if we can go to the next slide, and that is the issue of the options ahead. I think anyone would be wrong to rule out Netanyahu. He's been like the magician of Israeli politics. You love him, you hate him, whatever your views are. But I think even his critics will say, look, you look at the vaccine rollout, look at the Abraham Accords, startup nation. Israel's become a technological regional power. Does he get some credit for that? Others will say, but he could have done more on the Palestinian issue. Others will say, well, yeah, the Palestinians could have done more on the Palestinian issue. But I think I would say, as we meet today, April 21st, 2021, and I'm not a super dramatist here, but I think it's fair to say that this is his toughest moment right now that he's ever been in. The numbers are not adding up for him. He still has like 14 days. President Rivlin has given him the mandate, but he himself admits he doesn't have the numbers to get to 61. He's tried 4 times. My joke is Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, but 4 elections in a row over a 2-year period is a bit crazy. It's too democratic, you could say. But so right now, it doesn't look like he's got the numbers, and he's trying to talk about a direct election for prime minister as a way. He says, I don't want a 5th election because the 5th election people think is ridiculous. So he said, but just for prime minister. And but Israel isn't a presidential system. It once had a direct election for prime minister, but it's hard to graft on a presidential head and a president and a parliamentary body. You need 61 bare majority of seats to have a ruling majority in the 120-member Knesset. So things are not looking good for Bibi. There's a second thing, and we're going to show you a picture of him in a moment, is an alternative coalition, which is a hybrid of right, center, left parties. Some wonder, how stable is this? Naftali Bennett, whose parents have come from San Francisco, high tech, did well in high tech, young guy. And he is, on one hand, been on the right, but he has just announced just several hours ago, 5 hours ago, that if Bibi doesn't succeed the next 14 days, he's going to create his own coalition. And that seems to be ready for him to go. So, or the third option is a 5th election. Let's go to the next slide. And here's Bennett. Here's a picture of Bennett. And here's a picture of another kingmaker, a guy you've never heard of, maybe, unless you follow the stuff very closely. And that's the name Mansour Abbas. Already in Israeli satires, they call him Maoz Tzur Abbas. He's a dentist from the Galilee who has put together a faction of an Arab faction that has said, listen, the old Arab approach to Israel is wrong. You know, it was always just talk about the Palestinian issue, never talk about services. Well, the younger generation wants to be more integrated into Israel. And I think that's personally very good news. And we deserve our slice of the pie. And I don't care if it's right or left or center, but I will deal with whoever wants to deal with me. Now, he's from an Islamist faction. It's a party that you could say is that the Hamas wing of Israel, but it's a party that has disavowed violence, although they have visited certain terrorists in jail. But his approach is something very pragmatic that Israelis have been waiting for Israeli Arab leaders to talk like for a long time, which is, let's leave Palestine aside. Let's talk about how we work together and get services. And for the Israeli Arab community, and many Israeli Jews agree. He'll say, look, there's not enough Israeli police stations in Arab neighborhoods. He wants more Israeli law enforcement, not less. A lot of crime, of violent Arab on Arab crime. Where's the police? I need to get more police stations. The Israeli Jewish public wants to hear this more pragmatic approach. So in the first time in the 73 years of Israel, he could be part of that rival coalition. His preference actually was to go with Netanyahu, but Netanyahu has not been able to square the circle of Israeli Arab leaders and its right-wing edge of Bezalel Smotrich. And even though the Arabs would not sit in the coalition, they would sit be a parliamentary safety net outside the coalition to make sure it didn't fall. So Smotrich is, this is Abbas fellows talking to both sides. And I think, but Bibi is kind of losing him because Smotrich has attacked this guy. And he said, Bibi, defend me. I wanted to go with you. Just say that this is wrong. So there's been a lot of back and forth. To Netanyahu's credit, though, he's always been ahead of his rivals in kind of looking around the corner for the next big thing. And he has found that the Israeli Arab community is open to him more than he thought. He made 6 visits to Arab Israeli communities before the elections. But now it looks like the momentum is swinging the other way towards Naftali Bennett. We'll see in 2 weeks. But you're going to say, David, Bennett's on the right, right? And Gideon Sa'ar's on the right. And Avigdor Lieberman's on the right. But Benny Gantz is in the middle. And Labor and Meretz are on the left. David, how is this going to work? It's a fair question. And I think the answer is they're only going to be able to do very basic things. There hasn't been a budget in the country since 2018. You say that's no way to run a railroad. COVID relief, doesn't matter if you're right, you're center, you're left. Economic relief for COVID is something they can agree on. The Iranian nuclear threat, Arabs and Israelis agree on that. That will be part of it. So if you ask me, what would a non-Netanyahu government look like? I think it would be very similar. I think it would avoid more controversial issues on the Palestinian issues where the parties on the right and the parties on the left don't agree. But I think on basic functioning of government, it would happen. And it's going to be a tough time in Israeli politics because the prime minister is on trial for 3 charges of corruption. And I think what's interesting is how the Israeli system is saying, look, everyone, you're innocent until proven guilty. Prove your innocence. But one thing, don't denigrate the Zionist institutions of the judiciary that's independent and of law enforcement. That is something that I think Israelis, whether you're right, center, left, say, we've built, it's one of the great building foundations of Zionism. And, and that, I think that's really significant. I'd like to even, I'll just say one word about the Abraham Accords, and then I want to end with a story. And here is some good news here. The Abraham Accords, in my view, if we can go to the next, we'll skip a couple slides on the numbers, although we'll come back to it. But let's look at this for a moment. And I think you should feel such pride in Cleveland because, some of you are so ardent supporters of Israel, your parents, your grandparents, and the country had 600,000 people. Now it's a country of 9 million people. And it is something that the Arab states, the wealthier Arab states, think this is good for us. Good ties with Israel are good for us as Arabs. Why? Because we share we have aligned regional concerns. We're worried that energy dynamics in America means that the US doesn't need the Middle East as much. There could be retrenchment. I was in Abu Dhabi and I had a senior Emirati official say, David, we don't know what America's going to do in the Middle East, but we know there's one country in the world we could count on that they can't leave the Middle East because they live in the Middle East like us, and that's the Israelis. And they think like we think when it comes to Iran and jihadism. So, you know, that aligned regional thinking is remarkable. And then there's the issue of, you know, the economic benefit. This is a country, they see Israel, came out of nothing, 6,000 startups. And look how well they've done. Their GDP per capita is as high as France and Japan. And we in the Emirates, we've got $1.3 trillion for our sovereign wealth fund to invest in startups. The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Zayed, called Israel right in March and said, I want to invest $10 billion in Israel. No Arab has ever invested a nickel in Israel. But it's a changing Middle East. And it's a sense that we need Israel. We need more Israel. That's not something Israelis are used to. They're used to maybe a peace between governments, security forces. And I saw this before COVID. I was also in Egypt and Jordan, where the security people are talking on a first name basis with their Israeli counterparts. This has the hope of being a peace between peoples. This is something, if you've got a son or a daughter in college and say, what is an exciting story in the world you want to follow? I would say follow the story of the Emirati-Israeli peace, because high tech is going to bring Israelis and Arabs together. And here again, it's part of the solution, like we started this talk. Look at even tourism. 140,000 Israelis went to the Emirates. During a pandemic, they went to Dubai. Do you know in 2019, 4.3 million Israelis traveled abroad? That's almost half of the country, literally half of the country. Imagine the tourism upside here once the pandemic is over. This piece could take off like a rocket ship. And I'm not trying to be a super enthusiast, but you know, now that you even have Little League exchange programs between the Emirates and Israel, this is the people-to-people piece that Shimon Peres dreamed of. So I think, you know, when you think always about the Mideast, you always think how terrible things are, but think of the fact that the Arabs see in Israel just great opportunity. And I think, you know, to me, as I conclude this, and, you know, we talked about Iran, we talked about the Israeli election, we talk about the Abraham Accords, and I think the need to deepen them. I think the next big stop is to see with the Saudis, can you at least do something partial here? And can you somehow leverage that to some movement that would bring Israelis and Palestinians together? This doesn't have to be a bypass road. This could be a bridge, given the wealth of these Arab states. So there's enormous upside here, something that Israel has never seen before. And again, I try to choose my words carefully. I don't talk in hyperbole, but I think this has got real hope. But what's the basis of the hope? The hope is that Israel's institutions remain strong. I remember this final story I just want to tell is a story about Salam Fayyad. I was sitting with him in Ramallah, of all places. He said, I'm the only Palestinian to read Zionist history. And I noticed between 1917 and 1947, he said to me, the Zionists built the country, all the institutions, the universities, the science, the banks, the trade union, the clinics, everything was built. So by the time they declared the state was already built. And in many ways, we who love Israel so much, we see it. It was our grandparents who didn't know where this was going to lead, didn't know how these institutions would grow. And yet it has flourished to be the regional power that it is today. But that's because people like you guys in Cleveland and across the country, your parents, your grandparents cared deeply to build the state from the ground. They had no idea if it would succeed. And I think it succeeded way beyond its wildest dreams. So will Israel meet the challenges? I think it will. Are there difficult problems? I think there's no gainsaying that there's challenges. But when you think about it, when you think of the threats, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Iran, whether there are all sorts of jihadi al-Qaeda groups, ISIS, when you think about it, ultimately, it's Israel's will to live is greater than its enemies' will to die. And so in the most literal sense, Am Yisrael Chai. May we all go from strength to strength, come out of the darkness of this pandemic to a greater light. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. We have gotten some questions for you from members of the community, and I'll start with the first one. With respect to Iran, is it possible to remove some sanctions now and keep other sanctions in place until there's agreement on JCPOA 2.0?
That would be my hope. I mean, I don't know who asked the question, but I love the question. I would love to see it that you could somehow do an interim thing that Iran would see by getting rid of all the uranium that they get out. They get some relief, and by less for less, it leads us to more for more. And so from that person's mouth to God's ears, that would find a way. But there needs to be leverage that Iran will negotiate the 2.0. So I think that's really a good question.
Okay, another question is, the Abraham Accords are a sign for hope and optimism for the region. Do you think that will enable greater peace with the Palestinians?
That's why I said the part about bridge versus bypass. I think that, the people on one end, I tend to use sports analogies. So if you're not a sports fan, I apologize, but there are people in one end zone that see this as a bypass road and they're thrilled. There are people in the other end zone who see this as a bypass road and they mourn it and they think they're very upset by it. But I think most people are in the middle of the field and they say this is not necessarily a bypass road, it's a bridge. And I look at the Egypt and Jordan peace agreements, and what I saw is that these two countries did not want to stick out like sore thumbs. So actually, after they made peace with Israel, they got more interested in others broadening the circle of peace. So in my view, that's the way to go. And instead of the Palestinians cursing MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince, and burning him in effigy, work with the guy, because his father built a whole neighborhood in Gaza. This guy could build a city, 2 cities in the West Bank. And I noticed that Abbas has toned it down. He's toned down the rhetoric. And I think that's good. He restored his ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. But, this train has left the station. And I think that the Palestinians need to realize that the Arab states have deferred their interest when it comes to Israel since 2002, what's known as the Arab Peace Initiative, which was sequenced. So give the Palestinians whatever they want, and we won't do a thing with Israel. But you tried that for 18 years and it didn't work. And the Arab states are saying, hey, we got more and more convergence with Israel. We're concerned about Iran. We're concerned about the Brotherhood. We're concerned about jihadi groups. We love Israeli technology. So they're not willing to wait at the back of the bus, so to speak, and say, whenever you do it, maybe it'll take another generation, 2 or 3 generations. But they're saying is, we want to start now. And I think in a certain way, if the Emirati-Israeli peace is as good as I think it can be, and I realize I haven't had time to talk about Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco, and each one has its own dynamic. But the Emirati one, I think, is the crown jewel in terms of optimism. But to me, if you've got a thriving success story to emulate, it's going to bring more people around. It's going to bring the Palestinians around. The alternative road of rejection, who are the allies of the Iranians? It is, Hezbollah. That model, Lebanon's a failed state. Syria is a failed state with Iran in there. So, I think it's clear that a success breeds success. And I think we just have to be creative out of the box and think about, okay, this could be a bridge. And if you could get the Saudis now, even if they don't take the full step, even if they take a half a step. I wrote a paper on this for the Institute at the WashingtonInstitute.org. I've got a podcast where I've got over 40,000 listeners, downloaders. I hope you listen to it, Decision Points, where I talk about this. But I think that we got to think about how do we use the leverage of success to breed more success.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you, David. It was really very interesting. It's been a great hour with everybody. Thank you, Cleveland, for being with us here today. And please stay well and stay safe.
And on behalf of everyone you helped through your time and support of the Federation, thank you for making the impact together. Again, we say stay safe and good night.